The Vanishing of Dennis Martin. By the time you finish this, you'll either think I've lost my mind, or that the world is far stranger than you ever imagined. I've worked as a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for nearly 20 years. I've seen my share of odd things. Hikers who vanished only to reappear miles away, with no memory of how they got there, eerie lights flickering through the trees at night, even whispers on the wind that no one can explain. But the story I'm about to tell you is the one that keeps me up at night. I wasn't there in 1969 when Dennis Martin disappeared, but his story has haunted these woods for decades. I heard it for the first time on my first day as a rookie ranger, sitting around the fire with some of the veterans. They spoke in hushed tones, like even mentioning his name might summon something dark. Dennis Martin, one of them said, staring into the flames. Little boy, 7 years old, vanished without a trace on Father's Day weekend. Never found a damn thing. No clothes, no footprints, nothing. Another ranger leaned in, lowering his voice. Don't forget about the feral man. I laughed. Feral man? The laughter stopped dead. You'll see, the second ranger muttered, tossing another log onto the fire. The thing about the Smokies is, they're beautiful but unforgiving. Thick with trees, underbrush so dense it feels like a wall, and trails that twist and turn until you lose all sense of direction. You can step 10 feet off a trail and disappear completely from sight. I thought about that a lot as I learned the ropes. The Dennis Martin story became a sort of obsession for me. I read the reports, watched the news clips, even visited the exact spot near the Appalachian Trail where he was last seen. I stood there, imagining the little boy laughing, hiding behind a bush while his brother and friends counted to 10. Then nothing. It didn't make sense. A 7-year-old doesn't just vanish. Someone had to have seen something, heard something. But no one had. Or so I thought. A few years ago, a hiker named Mike showed up at my ranger station, pale as a ghost. He said he'd been out on a solo trip near Spence Field when he saw... Well, he couldn't explain it. There was this man, Mike said, wringing his hands. Or maybe it wasn't a man. He was filthy, long matted hair, clothes in tatters. But his eyes... God, those eyes weren't human. They were too wide, too bright. I tried to calm him down, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, but he grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. He was carrying something, Mike whispered. Something small, wrapped in what looked like old rags. I swear to God, it looked like a child. I froze. Where did you see this? I asked, my voice barely audible. Near the spot where that kid went missing, Mike said, his voice trembling. Near Spence Field. I didn't report Mike's story. I didn't even tell my colleagues. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy, or maybe some part of me didn't want to dig any deeper. But I couldn't let it go. I started going out to Spence Field on my days off, sometimes camping overnight, hoping to see or hear something that might explain what had happened to Dennis Martin. For months, there was nothing. Just the usual sounds of the forest, birds rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. But then, one night, everything changed. It was just past midnight. The moon hung low, casting long shadows through the trees. I was sitting by my campfire when the woods went silent. Not just quiet, silent, no wind, no insects, nothing. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but wrong. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, and I know them all. My hand went to my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The growl came again, closer this time. And then I saw it. Just a shadow at first, moving between the trees. It was tall, hunched, moving in a way that made my stomach turn. I thought about Mike's description. Filthy, ragged, inhuman eyes. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and get out, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to step into the light. And then it did. It wasn't a man. Not really. It stood on 2 legs, but its arms were too long, its posture too crooked. Its skin was pale, almost grey, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. And its face. I can't even describe its face. It looked at me, its head tilting to one side, as if trying to decide what I was. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just sat there, gripping my flashlight like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. Then it opened its mouth, and I swear to God, it spoke. Dennis. It wasn't a voice, it was a rasp, like the word was being dragged out of its throat. I don't remember running. I don't remember packing up my gear or finding my way back to the trail. The next thing I knew, I was in my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I didn't go back to Spence Field after that. I couldn't. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it had anything to do with Dennis Martin or if my imagination had finally gotten the best of me. But here's the thing. After that night, I started noticing something. The Dennis Martin case isn't the only one. Over the years, dozens of people have disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains, many of them under circumstances just as strange. No one talks about it. Not the rangers, not the locals, no one. It's like there's an unspoken rule: don't ask questions you don't want answers to. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that thing in the woods. The way it moved, the way it looked at me. And I wonder, what if Dennis didn't disappear? What if he's still out there? And what if he's not alone? The vanishing of Stacey Ann Arras. The wilderness has a way of getting under your skin. You don't just hear it, you feel it. The rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, the shadows that creep in as the sun dips behind the jagged peaks. Everything conspires to remind you how small you are, how utterly insignificant. And yet it draws you in. I've always been a sucker for places like Yosemite. They promise freedom, an escape from the grind, a communion with something bigger. I guess that's why I agreed to join the search for Stacey Ann Arras back in the summer of 1981. At 28, I was just a park ranger in training, eager to prove myself. I had no idea what I was walking into. Stacey was a seasoned hiker, young, vibrant, the kind of person whose smile could light up the darkest trail. She'd set out alone to explore the Sunrise Lakes area, camera in hand, her backpack meticulously packed. The last anyone saw of her, she was chatting with another group of hikers, snapping photos of the pristine wilderness. By all accounts, she was fine. Then poof, she was gone. I still remember the urgency in the air when we got the call. Missing persons weren't unheard of, but this felt different. Stacey's parents were adamant. She was careful, prepared, not the type to just disappear. The search started immediately. Helicopters buzzed overhead, search dogs sniffed the ground, and we combed every inch of the trail where she was last seen. For days we found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle. Just emptiness. Then, about a week in, we found her camera. It was perched on a flat rock, like someone had placed it there intentionally. The film inside was still intact. I'll never forget the eerie quiet that fell over the group as we flipped through the developed photos later that evening. The pictures were stunning: sprawling meadows, towering cliffs, sunrise lakes shimmering in the golden light. But there was something off about the last few shots. They were blurry, as if Stacey had been moving when she took them. One frame caught the edge of something pale and humanoid lurking in the trees. "That's just a trick of the light," one of the senior rangers said. But his voice wavered, and his eyes lingered on the photo a beat too long. The next day, I volunteered to search the area where the camera had been found. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers, or maybe I just wanted to prove I wasn't scared. Whatever the reason, I went alone. The forest felt different. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of the air, as if the trees were pressing in, watching. Around midday, I stumbled across a patch of ground where the grass had been flattened, like something large had passed through. I crouched down, running my fingers over the crushed blades, when I heard it. A whistle. Not the friendly kind you'd use to call a dog or get someone's attention. This was low, deliberate, and far too human. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. No response, just that eerie whistle, repeating itself every few seconds, always from a different direction. I pressed on, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind, I thought. Or a bird. But deep down, I knew better. As the sun began to set, I reached a small clearing. In the center was an old, gnarled tree with twisted branches that looked like claws reaching for the sky. At its base was something metallic, a mirror, cracked and smeared with dirt. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I felt it. A presence. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The clearing was empty, but the shadows between the trees seemed to writhe, shifting in the fading light. "Stacy," I whispered, though I didn't really expect an answer. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its skin was as pale as bone. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and though I couldn't make out its eyes, I felt them boring into me. I don't remember running, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was back at camp gasping for breath. When I tried to tell the others what I'd seen, they dismissed it as exhaustion, stress, maybe a trick of the light. But I know what I saw. Stacey Ann Arras was never found. Officially, her disappearance remains unsolved, a tragic mystery lost to the vast wilderness of Yosemite. But I'll tell you this, something took her, something that doesn't belong in this world. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whistle. The woods took him. I still see his face when I close my eyes. His wide, boyish grin, a pair of dimples that could make you smile on your worst day, and his eyes, curious, full of life. Jared, my nephew, my sister's pride and joy. It's been more than 30 years, and I still hear his laughter echoing through the trees when the wind is just right. But on that day, July 20th, 1991, his laughter turned to silence, and the forest swallowed him whole. We were in the San Bernardino National Forest, a sprawling expanse of pines and canyons that stretch endlessly into the horizon. My sister Linda, her husband Jared, his younger sister Molly, and I had decided on a camping trip to escape the oppressive heat of Los Angeles. A chance to breathe fresh mountain air, to disconnect. It was supposed to be a weekend of s'mores, ghost stories, and stargazing. We arrived at the campsite mid-morning, and the kids were off like shots, racing each other into the trees while we set up the tents. Jared had always been a little explorer. He was the kind of kid who wanted to climb every tree, overturn every rock, and chase every rustling sound in the bushes. "Be careful," Linda yelled after him, laughing, "and stay where we can see you." He gave her a mock salute and vanished into the woods with Molly. That night we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows around the fire. Jared was unusually quiet, staring into the flames as though lost in thought. "What's on your mind, buddy?" I asked. He looked up at me, his face serious. "I saw something today," he said. "What kind of something?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was big. Bigger than you." We all laughed, assuming he'd spotted a deer or maybe a bear in the distance. "Probably just your imagination, kiddo," I said, ruffling his hair. But the way he looked back into the fire, his small hands gripping his knees tightly, made my stomach twist. The next morning, Jared and Molly were playing hide-and-seek around the campsite. Linda and I were making breakfast when Molly came running back, her face pale. "I can't find Jared," she said. I chuckled. "He's probably just hiding really well. You know how he is." But as the minutes stretched into half an hour, unease crept in. "Jared," we called, walking through the trees. "Time to come out, buddy." Nothing. By noon we were panicked. Linda's voice cracked as she screamed his name into the woods. Her husband ran back to the car to get help, leaving us pacing, searching, calling. The forest, so alive and welcoming just the day before, had turned cold and indifferent. By evening the search teams arrived. Men and women in neon vests spread out with flashlights, their voices echoing through the trees. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their beams cutting through the growing darkness. But it was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. We found his footprints the next day, about a mile from the campsite. Small, uneven prints heading up a steep incline. Then they stopped abruptly, as though he'd simply vanished into thin air. The days blurred into weeks, and the search grew more desperate. Bloodhounds lost his scent at the same spot his footprints ended. No torn clothing, no signs of struggle, just nothing. Then, weeks later, they found his camera. It was lying on the forest floor near a ridge we hadn't searched before, its strap caked with mud. Linda clutched it like a lifeline as the ranger handed it over. The film was intact, and we rushed to have it developed. The photos were wrong. The first few were normal. Jared grinning at the camera, a few shots of Molly making goofy faces, the campsite, the trees. But as we flipped through them, the images became stranger. Blurry shots of the forest, as though the camera had been dropped or swung wildly. A photo of the sky, taken at an odd angle, the tops of the trees silhouetted against a grey expanse. And then, the last photo. It was Jared, close up, as if he'd turned the camera on himself. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his lips slightly parted as though he were about to speak. But his expression wasn't one of fear. It was something worse. It was the look of someone who'd seen something they couldn't understand. Behind him, just over his shoulder, was something. The figure was tall and shadowy, blending almost seamlessly with the trees. It was humanoid, but wrong, its proportions off in subtle, nauseating ways. And its eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light. That image burned itself into my brain. We showed it to the search team, but they dismissed it as a trick of the light, pareidolia. They told us it was just Jared, lost and scared, taking one final picture before wandering off. But I knew better. I felt it. The forest had taken him. Years have passed, and I've tried to move on. But every now and then, I dream of Jared. He's standing at the edge of the woods, looking back at me. He doesn't speak, but his eyes say everything. Help me. And every time I wake up, I hear the same sound echoing in my mind. The faint, distant laughter of a boy, carried on the wind, just beyond the trees.